Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta-story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective.
Hi there! I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 37. Your discomfort zone. Talking last time about our two selves, our self that is and our self that acts, or what we might think of again as our body and our conscious self, and why we disconnect from that body self, kind of made me want to dig in deeper to some of those whys, especially because a couple of them have been topics that I wanted to talk about on the podcast anyway, basically since I had the idea for this podcast. So, honestly, why not get into them now? It's a great time. So the first idea that I want to go over is how it actually feels to exist in our body, like what our relationship to how it feels in our body has historically been, and what part that plays in our personal growth journey, especially with regard to our sort of personal development philosophy. Because there is this theme that comes up a lot in the personal development world that, we need to get out of our comfort zone. And we really need to learn how to get comfortable being uncomfortable. This sort of concept that, we naturally resist changing anything because new always feels uncomfortable, and therefore we need to be able to embrace that instead. And that's not wrong. But also there's an and here, because if you have spent your entire life operating outside of your comfort zone, in the sense that you have been perpetually required to extend yourself beyond your actual capacity, and you have been conditioned to finding that sense of overwhelm and discomfort on a physical level normal, how might that reality then interact with this axiom of, you need to push outside your comfort zone, you need to get uncomfortable? If you have been so conditioned to being uncomfortable that basically existing in chronic, mild, or even moderate discomfort is your normal, and then you're told, if you want to grow, if you want to change, you got to get uncomfortable. How far are we going to take that? Are you going to be pushing past discomfort and into distress? Are you going to be going from overextension to hyperextension? I think the actual answer is about your psychological discomfort, not your physical discomfort. But I have not ever heard anybody who uses that phrase make that distinction and make it clear that what they in fact mean is not to put your body past its limits, not to put your body into distress, not to put your nervous system into overload and overwhelm and discomfort and distress, but rather to challenge your psychological sense of normalcy, which could in fact be scaling back, doing less. We remember that theme from last week that I am still fighting about. But you know what? Doing less, it makes me uncomfortable psychologically, but it kind of feels good physically. So we'll talk more about the doing less aspect at the end here. But what I really wanted to focus on is, aside from that kind of overall theme of comfort zone versus discomfort zone, but how do we get to a place where we have completely normalized to overextending our bodies and disregarding our sense of overwhelm and our cues. So let's do a quick review of human resilience and learning patterns. Our greatest gift as a species is also sometimes our biggest weakness. We are wired for adaptability. Human beings are survivors. We can get used to anything, good or bad. And we stop being particularly affected by the things around us when we no longer find them novel. And at that point, we just kind of get on with it. They don't draw so much of our attention. They don't matter so much. The phrase familiarity breeds contempt is a cliche for a reason. It's because that's exactly what happens. If we get very used to something, we just kind of stop noticing it. We have to consciously counteract that force of accustomization to not fall asleep to our own lives. And in my opinion, that is our true life's work as conscious, sovereign, intelligent beings. But this tendency to adapt and to stop noticing the conditions that we're in leaves us vulnerable to tolerating bad conditions long after we have to. You know, there might be times when we really do need to just survive bad conditions, and this is actually a strength that we can do this, that we can get accustomed to them and just get on with it and live anyway. But at some point, we have to stop and ask ourselves if those conditions have changed. Are we now able to get out of that surviving through suboptimal or even bad conditions? Because if we don't, we can literally forget that there's any other way to be. We can forget that there's other ways to live and to experience this world, to experience our bodies. And for some of us, we might not ever have known another way of being. That's actually the set of circumstances I kind of want to focus on today. What it's like to never feel safe and good in your body in the first place. See, when we learn based on our experiences, and our minds will learn what to expect based on, honestly, our initial experience is often the starting point, but then if that gets overwritten by different experiences that repeat way more often, at some point we can reset our baseline. So our expectations are fluid to an extent, but they're also rooted in what we know, what we have already experienced, and therefore what we have already survived. And the reason that we have a bias toward repeating what we have known or even replicating the same conditions that we have experienced before is that we have proof they are survivable. Unknowns are just that, not known. They might be survivable conditions, or they might not. So this is why sometimes, if we're not being very conscious of it, we can choose familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. If we're still here, then we can confirm that that hell was survivable. Therefore, it feels safer to us on a subconscious level than something new. So let's think about that in terms of our self that is, our body, as being the first environment of our conscious mind. Our self that is the first context our self that acts interacts with. And it is the deepest context for experience that we will ever have. The conditions within our body itself are the conditions we filter every other environment and every other experience through. What our body feels and how our mind connects to it and integrates with it is our most basic baseline for normal. So if you exist in a body that has, say, a +5 pain level at all times, your normal for pain is going to be a 5 on, like, let's call it an objective scale. Your subjective sense of 0 is actually going to be a 5. And so on a day when you were only at +3 pain, to you, that's great. You're at -2. That's a really good day. It's amazing. You feel wonderful. But somebody whose subjective pain experience is actually 0 would be taking that +3 pain day as kind of a bad day. Like, oh, I don't feel so great today. Maybe I should skip that workout or stay home. So the measures that we use for our experience inside of ourself are basically entirely subjective, because we can't ever get into someone else's body. We can't know how someone else actually feels inside their own internal landscape. All we can do is just describe with words what we're experiencing and hope that we're able to get some kind of approximation of each other's experiences that way. But we can't maybe really objectively clearly know, because at least at this time we can't switch bodies. There are some things that just kind of have to be experienced to be understood. So maybe if we could switch bodies and you could have an experience of an actual 0 body, like a 0 pain body, then maybe that would change your baseline or your expectation or your understanding of what's going on in your body. Maybe that would inspire you to try and make some lifestyle changes, or to go talk to a doctor and say, actually, I'm experiencing this chronic low-level pain all the time. Is there anything we can do? Can we investigate why this is happening and, see what measures we might be able to do to remedy it? But if you never had that experience, or you never even had a conversation with someone, to discover that that's not everyone's normal, that maybe that's not something that you have to just survive, you might not ever know. And I feel like one of the hardest gaps to overcome in recovery, especially from like childhood wounds, is the fact that we don't know what we don't know. If we've never had an embodied experience of something, we don't know that we haven't had it. As an example, if we have never really felt fully unconditionally accepted and loved by someone, we wouldn't know that maybe every single time we've interacted with anybody in our entire life, there's been kind of a low-level activation of our nervous system, and maybe like a bit of a fawn response or something in that activation, where we can't just authentically be ourselves and be completely at peace in our parasympathetic relaxation mode. But because that was all we ever knew, we didn't realize that until maybe someday we had an experience where we actually felt safe and relaxed with somebody and said, oh my God, I've never had this before in my entire life, but I didn't know. Again, until we have an embodied experience of something, we just don't know what we don't know. Another example might be if, we think that we're really emotionally tuned in and self-aware, and don't know that we're actually not fully feeling our emotions because we're somewhat disconnected from our own body, because we have been since childhood. This happened to me about 12 years ago. I'm the one who used to think that I was really tuned in, and I had no idea that I was not, until I learned. Until we get a more embodied experience of our emotions, for example, we can't know how or to what degree they've been muted all along. If they have gotten muted along the way, we might understand that it happened. We might think, oh gosh, things used to feel so much more intense to me. But we might also not view that as a problem. We might assume that it's a function of getting older, either that, things just tend to level off because your hormones have leveled off, or that, you have more experience, so you can put things in perspective, and you just don't get as big of feelings about things in general because of that. And to some extent that might be true, but it might also be that we've been numbing out and not recognizing that because we just think that's how life goes. That it's really brilliant and, fully in color when we're children, and then slowly kind of fades to shades of gray by middle age. So what happens if you then get an experience where they're completely turned on again, like all the way? Then you can feel the difference and you see what you've been missing. And so that type of embodied knowledge, or what maybe you could think of as somatic experiencing, can be really hard to understand if you're just using words, because like by definition of what is happening, it defies words. Words create approximations and stand-ins, but they can't really do justice to experiential knowledge and felt sense experiences, felt sense learning. What we might think of as transrational learning. So these transrational things that must be felt to be understood, things that happen in our body self, our self that is, our emotional self. These things are happening in our first and most formative environment. And if our kind of normalized experience of that environment is a compromised experience, then we can literally spend a lifetime having that relationship to our body compromised and never even know it. Because to us, that is normal. That is our zero pain level. That is our subjective sense of what is right and proper because it is what we have always known. That disconnection, or that maybe static in the line, or that pain, or that activation in our nervous system, it's been there all along. So how could we have noticed it? If there's no contrast to create a clarity that these two feeling states are different, then how were we supposed to understand what that feeling state was? It was just normal. It's just how things feel. It's just how my body feels. So we will perpetually experience that way of being and not really think to challenge it. And if something does disrupt it, we might unthinkingly try to recreate what we consider to be normal without stopping to question if it is optimal, if it's actually what we want, or if maybe we like this new state a little bit better. So I will dig a little bit deeper with myself as an example, so you can get a better sense of how this might actually work in action and how this might develop in someone. I personally identify with the label of highly sensitive person. Basically, I have a nervous system that takes in information very deeply, and I feel things very strongly, stronger than average sensory sensitivity. And I don't know whether I have stronger than average emotional sensitivity, or if it's simply that the way I feel emotions in my body triggers my sensory sensitivity, and so it kind of goes hand in hand. So I am very easily overstimulated on a physical level, and I get overwhelmed when I have too much sensory input, or if I have pushed too far past my actual energy for that day. This overwhelm manifests as pain in my body. It's not like intense pain, but it is noticeable pain. So maybe like a +1, +2, +3 kind of pain. And it's just kind of this burning along some of my nerves and in my skin. And it just kind of comes from the inside out with this sense of fragility, and like if something hit me, I would just break into a bunch of pieces. I hope from that description you can tell that it's not particularly comfortable. But for me, this is very normal in the sense that I have been experiencing it since I was a child. And those sensations are what I tend to mean when I say, I'm tired. Now, when you hear the phrase, I'm tired, does that actually convey to you those sensations that I described of like burning nerves and skin that hurts if you touch it? Probably not. Because now that I'm an adult and I have a better sense of what tired means versus what overstimulated means, I don't think those words are interchangeable. And I would probably mean something different if I were to say I'm tired than I'm overstimulated. But when I was a child, my child's mind and perception and vocabulary didn't know the difference. And so that was what I meant when I tried to tell adults around me I'm tired. It was being tired to the point that I could not endure anymore. But what they heard is, oh, you're starting to feel tired. So, you'll be fine. You can push through. You can keep going. It's just a little bit more. And so I was routinely forced to keep going despite being at my limit or past it. And that's just kind of how it was. If they were not ready to leave or stop with what we were doing, then I just had to endure the situation. I don't think that they understood the level of sensory distress that I was in. And I think that if they had, they probably would have responded differently. But for my child's vocabulary, I communicated my need. I'm tired. I need to stop, and was told no. Just deal with it. Just survive. And so I did. I learned to keep going and to endure going well past my limit. I learned that I wasn't going to get a break and I wasn't going to get to stop. And so it was either exist in my body in a lot of pain or start disconnecting from it and start numbing. So I started turning down those inputs and my, tuning out my awareness of it as much as I could. Myself that acts was turning away from myself that is because it had to in order to cope with the physical discomfort from that overstimulation. Myself that is basically became an unsafe environment for myself that acts, my conscious self. So for me, I normalized this baseline level of disconnection from my body because I had a baseline level of discomfort in my body. And that meant that my pain threshold and my discomfort threshold were extended way beyond what we would normally mean when we say discomfort. Basically, if I wasn't nearly screaming from pain, then I wasn't hurt. And if I could physically force myself to keep going, then I actually wasn't tired. Like, my definitions for those terms were really extreme. That was what I normalized to, because that was what the world and my culture demanded of me. And I just kind of assumed it was how everybody experienced things. It led to me working myself into burnout over and over and over again because I was so used to being past my capacity most of the time. It didn't occur to me that I could stop before I hit kind of a burnout. It did not occur to me that I was experiencing anything uncommon or unusual, or that maybe these things I was experiencing were hurting me in one way or another. And, the thing is, I'm not special or unique in this experience. The phenomenon of pushing past our body's window of optimal stimulation or output is entirely normal in Western culture. We are inundated from childhood, or at least millennials were. I don't know, and prior generations. I don't know what's happening with Gen Z, Gen Alpha. Maybe they've got it better. But at least people, my age and older have been brainwashed with these ideas of grit and toughness and persevering and just making do and enduring and carrying on. We all push our bodies too hard. We glorify hustle culture and burnout culture. We force children to go along with our adult agendas because it's too inconvenient to us to actually listen to their limits or to take them seriously when they say that they're hurt or they're in discomfort or distress or that something's wrong, especially if it's a situation where we don't see why they should be. We know better than you do. So we teach our children too to ignore their body's pain and exhaustion signals. So I might be more sensitive than average. I might have a unique way that these sensations of overwhelm manifest in my body, but that simply means that I had a better chance than average of hearing my body screaming after I had stopped listening to it. And when I stopped disconnecting, it was actually really horrifying to see how much I was forcing my body to endure. And I really, really try to honor my limits now, but I also still regularly go over them because even though it's been basically 10 years since I got dropped fully back into my body, I'm still trying to figure out where my limits are. That kind of casual cruelty that many of us show toward our bodies, toward our self that is, comes from being given treatment, whether it was knowing and intentional or totally accidental and inadvertent, from our caretakers, that creates an imprint of our body environment as just kind of chronically having that level of exhaustion or overwhelm. That becomes our baseline, our zero. That is not the same as that actually being zero. It's just that what our mind learns is to interpret that level of signal as zero. So let's circle back then to this idea of discomfort and how we need to get used to being uncomfortable in order to grow. To me, the phrases like pushing past your comfort zone and make discomfort your new comfort zone honestly echo the toxic hustle, productivity, burnout cult that we have. The thing is, I think what that probably is supposed to mean is like going 1 to 4% beyond our comfort zone. I think I've talked about that skill challenge gap before, how the optimal challenge zone for getting into flow and for staying really engaged with a process is that 1 to 4% beyond your current skill level. So it's a bit of a stretch. Like you can tell that you're having to reach for something, but it's also, it feels like reaching for something, on the top shelf. You can get to it. It's not something that's really beyond your your wingspan. I don't know, arm span. There we go. Humans have arms. You're not being stretched to the point of breaking. You're not being stretched to a point where you can't go back to the same shape afterward. But if you grew up always being stretched to, say, 40% beyond your actual capacity, then a 1 to 4% stretch isn't even going to register as a stretch. You are so normalized to existing beyond anything like comfort that the thought of stretching out of your comfort zone is viscerally horrifying or existentially exhausting because, like, you're already extended 40% beyond your capacity. How much more can you go? How can you possibly stretch more? How can you possibly get more uncomfortable? And honestly, if that's your experience of being that kind of chronically overextended, then the suggestion that you need to get even more uncomfortable to grow is kind of linking the concept of growth and change with violence, because that's how you would experience any further expansion. If you have already been stretched to the point of distortion where you can't go back to what you were, you've lost all of your elastic potential, then going even further is just going to create a rupture. Like you're going to split apart and not even be in one piece anymore. And if you've been overextended like that for your entire span of consciousness, I mean, like, my God, your poor self that is, my poor self that is. And honestly, our poor selves that act too, having to choose between survival and wholeness, between the physical pain of overextension and the psychological pain of cutting itself off from its other half, from its partner. So if you hear a phrase like, get out of your comfort zone, and it just sounds exhausting, like, it's okay that that's your reaction. Maybe your growth task, in fact, is to do less. Maybe the comfort zone you need to leave is your discomfort zone, that 40% overextension. Maybe it's time to get comfortable with actually being comfortable inside your body, inside your first and most precious environment. Or, maybe you just need to be a little less uncomfortable inside of it. Maybe there's a process here where you have to go from being 40% overextended down to like 30% overextended, and then maybe down to 20, and then 10, and then 5, then maybe finally not being overextended at all. And each of those contraction points is going to reveal new secrets about your body self, your self that is, and your conscious relationship to it. Or at least it did for me. It wasn't until I started doing less in the first place that I realized how often I had been pushing myself into burnout. And then when I did even less, I started to learn how tired I was all the time and how much rest I actually needed. And when I was doing even less, I could finally start to understand the pleasure of being still. And finally, doing even less, I've been able to find genuine pleasure in existing in my body. Like, it doesn't have to hurt all the time. It doesn't have to be a negative environment for my consciousness to inhabit all the time. So, yeah, if you've been doing too much for too long, then maybe your discomfort that you need to embrace is doing less. Maybe even less than that. So that's all for this week. Thank you so much for tuning in and spending this time with me. If you want to know more about my work as a coach, you can check out thepatternbreaker.com. My Instagram that I hardly ever bother to update is @thepatternbreaker. If you want to join my Patreon and support the podcast, support my work, you can check out patreon.com/narrative responsibility. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?